Thank you very much for coming today. I know that we are competing with a college senior members program tonight, so it's wonderful to see you here. You have a real interest on Southeast European matters, which is truly appreciated. And on behalf of my co-conveners of this seminar, David Madden and Jessica Pencheva, I'm Othon Anastasakis, the director of CSOX, for those of you who don't know me. This is the first seminar. This is the start of our seminar series, a Hillary term seminar series that we do every year, same time. But it's also the first one of the decade, of the new decade. So it's a very special one. And the topic is one of our favorite at CSOX. We like to talk geopolitics at CSOX. But we don't talk geopolitics from an IR perspective alone. We like to think of ourselves, and we are, different disciplines that work together, and we look at this subject from various disciplinary points of views. Now, 4 years ago, we had a similar Hillary term seminar series, which was about insecurity in the region and the geopolitics of fear, as we called it back then. And back then, we looked at the region in the context of a surrounded triangle of insecurity. It was the Ukraine war, which was very prominent. There was Syria war and the Middle Eastern crisis. There was North Africa as well, and the waves of refugees and instability. So we looked back then at the challenges in the region from a geopolitical perspective and in the context of the return of geopolitics. And indeed, this is a topic that is still relevant today, the return of geopolitics, some say with a vengeance, or what has been termed also the new Cold War between the West and Russia, or the war between the West and the New East, meaning China. And that is and of course, the role of the United States and the multipolar world that it is creating. But this is one dimension that we would like to look in our seminar series, because there are other things that we want to look as well. It's the balance of power and the geopolitics of fear, as we defined it 4 years ago. But there are also new issues, and if we just stick to that kind of geopolitical, very much balance of power perspective, we may be looking at the topic partially, because I think that there are three outdated assumptions that I would like very, very briefly just to talk to you so as to introduce our discussion and the wider discussion of our seminar series. The first outdated assumption is that actors, be they big states or small states or middle-sized states, they act as unified actors. And that's not the reality anymore today. I mean, we do see divisions between the countries themselves when they operate in geopolitical matters. We see the US, how divided it is between the Trumpian protectionism and the internationalists within the United States. We see the European Union as well, which is divided between those who are the integrationists and those who seek to bring back control to their national capitals. Then we see even the countries themselves, like Britain or Poland or France, Hungary, how divided they are. And then we also see the transatlantic partnership itself, which we will be discussing today. But this is not a given. It's not a kind of unified context either. And even authoritarian states that we will be examining as external actors, like Russia or China, I mean, how far unified they are as well, because we do see that there is opposition within them. The second outdated assumption that is also relevant to our seminar series is that international security is based on territorially defined borders, that it is military and zero-sum in nature. And on the contrary, or complementing this, is actually contemporary geopolitical uncertainty involves new risks and new threats, and also a new definition of borders in a way. So when we look at the climate change, for instance, we don't have any borders whatsoever. When we look at digitalization, we see the threat of cybersecurity. And that is something that we will also be discussing and how that impacts on Southeast Europe. When we look at migration or the refugee problem, we do see a different notion of borders and maps, and organized crime as well, another challenge. which we discussed last year in our diaspora, SISOX diaspora project. So that means that we don't look, in our seminars, we don't want to look exclusively only in hardcore security zero-sum terms, because these risks actually, they can also be positive sum, and they are common to countries that are competing with each other. And since we're discussing NATO today, we should be reminded of what Macron said. You know, is it a brain-dead organization that is not able to understand the threats? And also his other interesting notion as well, that maybe countries should cooperate with each other, even if they are competitors. In a way, introducing that notion of co-competition. Not cooperation, no competition, but co-competition. And the third outdated assumption, which touches upon our interdisciplinarity in a way, who do we believe are the actors? Because, yes, of course, states and diplomacy are the actors in moving the geopolitics of the world, but we also see other actors as well. We have, for instance, economic actors, or non-governmental actors, or civil resistance, or the migrants, or the refugees, social groups actually that are able to move geopolitics of our world. So these are some of the thoughts that I wanted to relate to you in this first seminar that we are starting with Western perspectives. And of course the title, which is Western Approaches to Southeast Europe, Engagement or Neglect. The word approaches was chosen deliberately because it's not just one approach, it's many approaches, and sometimes they are rather confusing with each other. And then the notion of engagement versus neglect. Some might consider engagement what others may consider to be neglect, and in case the messages that these countries in the region get are very unclear. And we've got two speakers today who are experts in these matters to discuss with us. First, starting with Mirena Pencheva, who is our EU visiting fellow this year. We are delighted that Mirena is with us, also because she comes from Bulgaria, so she has a different understanding of the region as well, but she comes from the legal department of the European Parliament, where she worked for many, many years, and she deals with issues of security and cooperation from a legal perspective, but also from the perspective of the region of Southeast Europe, to which we will be talking today, focusing on the European Union. And then we've got Jarek Wisniewski, who is an expert on almost all the topics that we will be discussing in the seminar series, but today we want him to talk about NATO and the role of this wider security transatlantic environment, and how that actually fits into the region of Southeast Europe. We have agreed 20 to 25 minutes each, and then we will have a very nice brainstorming question and answer discussion. Before you start, I want to thank Julie, because that magnificent leaflet here was done by her, and please, consult it, during the course of our seminar. Sorry, Mirena, it had to be said. Yeah.
Indeed.
Absolutely.
It is a really, really nice one, and thank you, Julie.
You're welcome.
So before I start, I have to do the usual for these occasions disclaimer that the views and opinions expressed are my own personal views and opinions and do not necessarily represent the official position of the European Parliament. Now that this has been said, a couple of preliminary remarks. First, as Othon said, I will be talking about the EU approaches to Southeast Europe. And secondly, when I talk about Southeast Europe, I will be talking about the Western Balkans, because the two are used as synonyms in the most recent EU documents. So I will not be talking about Turkey, but if you have any questions about this, just ask me in the Q&A session. There are, as Othon said, not one but many approaches to engagement. And there are many platforms through which the EU engages with the Western Balkans. Some of them are within the EU framework, some of them are within the EU framework, and some of them are outside. And the one that is by far the most far-reaching, technically complex, and politically controversial as of late is the enlargement framework. As we know, enlargement fatigue has set in. Enlargement fatigue has set within the EU after the last three waves of enlargement. And in order to try and revitalize the process a bit, the Commission adopted in February 2018 a communication on a credible enlargement perspective for an enhanced EU engagement with the Western Balkans. In that communication, the Commission set out 6 flagship initiatives, basically explaining how the EU will engage with the Western Balkans in the coming years in order to revitalize the process. These initiatives covered a number of topics such as rule of law, security, migration, reconciliation, and so on. However, the enlargement process, even though in theory it is an EU supranational process, in reality it always ends up being a national issue. And this is the case anytime you have unanimity either in the Council or in the European Council. That means that something that has been conceived as a supranational process gets reduced to the purely national interests of every single member state. And we saw that at the European Council in October 2019, when we had one member state, France, vetoing the setting of a date for opening accession negotiations with Albania and North Macedonia. This is also not an isolated occurrence. This has happened before, and it has happened within the EU. It happened with the Schengen free area, where new member states are obliged to fulfill certain conditions and then join the Schengen free area. Bulgaria and Romania, when they joined, started working towards fulfilling these conditions, and as of 2011, both the Commission and the European Parliament gave the green light for accession to the Schengen area. However, ultimately it was to the member states to decide against unanimously, and something that was expected to be a purely technical decision ended up being vetoed by a small group of member states. And 9 years later, there is still a veto there. So I'm worried that in terms of the enlargement perspective and enlargement process as a way of engagement, if the veto is not lifted, the French veto for Albania and North Macedonia is not lifted soon, we're going to end up in a situation where it's going to, 9 years later, we will still be talking about it and it will still be there. So if we have to talk about the enlargement process as a platform for engagement, I would say there we are on the knife's edge between engagement and neglect, and we are sliding towards neglect. And that is really not ideal, considering that in the meantime, other geopolitical players are looking to increase their influence within the region. So this is not the time for the EU or the member states to be contemplating what the perfect enlargement process should look like. But we are where we are. Within the EU, through its agencies or institutions, engages with the Western Balkans also through the framework of various sectoral EU policies. And as Othon mentioned, I work in the field of security cooperation, so that is the field I know best. And in the last 4 or 5 years, there has been a lot happening there. So whilst in enlargement, we have basically come to a standstill, in sectoral policies, engagement with the Western Balkans is thriving. In the field of terrorism, there has been a lot happening. In October 2018, the EU and the Western Balkans agreed a joint action plan on counter-terrorism with the Western Balkans. And on the basis of this joint action plan, which set out 5 objectives that both the EU and the Western Balkans will strive to achieve by the end of this year, on the basis of this joint action plan, the Commission then agreed specific tailor-made priorities and actions with each and every one of the Western Balkan partners, and this happened in October, November last year, so just a few months ago. A lot has been happening in the field of border management as well, and currently 5 out of the 6 Western Balkan partners have an agreement with the European Border and Coast Guard Agency, formerly known as Frontex, which allows the agency to deploy teams within the territory of the Western Balkan partners. Disinformation as well. In 2017, the European External Action Service set up a task force to deal with disinformation within the region and to promote a fact-based narrative about the EU, as well as to reach wider audiences within the region. So these platforms for engagement through sectoral EU policies, the way I see them, engagement there is going to continue and it is going to grow. And the reason for that, there are actually two reasons for that. On the one hand, the benefits for the EU, and on the other hand, the lack of disadvantages for the EU. In terms of benefits, if you look at these areas, and that applies to all the other sectoral areas of engagement, these are areas which are born out of a need that the EU has. So it is an actual self-serving form of engagement. The EU engages because it is important for the EU. The spike in engagement in the field of terrorism, it came after the many terrorist attacks on the EU territory. Border management. The need addressed is the migratory pressure on the EU. Disinformation, several needs. One is to fight foreign influence within the region. Another one is also to fight extremism and radicalization by countering propaganda within the region. So the benefits for the EU are very clear, and this makes that kind of engagement very politically uncontroversial. The second big reason why this will continue is the lack of perceived or real disadvantages. Enlargement comes with a number of, as I say, perceived or real disadvantages for the member states. First, if you allow new member states, that means that your own relative weight within the EU will decrease. Not everyone is happy for this. Secondly, the Western Balkans will not be net contributors, they will be net recipients. So there are countries that would not be happy about that either. As there are poorer member states, they will compete for cohesion funding and other funding, so the current countries that are receiving money from that pot would also possibly not be happy about it. And ultimately we have the intra-EU migration, which has actually been one of the main reasons for the enlargement fatigue, and as we know, it was very hotly debated during the Brexit referendum as well. So all these things that come with enlargement, they are not present when you engage to these various sectoral EU policies, and this is why I believe that we do not risk falling into neglect. It is going to continue being as engagement. Good. Beyond engagement within the EU, there are also other platforms for engagement outside of the EU, but with the participation of the institutions or some of the member states of the EU. One such platform is the Berlin process. It was launched in 2014 by Merkel at the time, initially, for 4 years, till 2018, but it has now been extended and an end date has not been set yet. According to the final declaration of the German chair, the goal of the Berlin process is to make additional real progress in the reform process, in resolving outstanding bilateral and internal issues, and in achieving reconciliation within and between the societies in the region, enhancing regional economic cooperation, and laying the foundations for sustainable growth. So as you see, the mandate is huge. It pretty much covers any type of cooperation you could possibly wish for, which is obviously of added value, because if there is a will to cooperate, it will fit into this mandate. The participants of the Berlin process are the 6 Western Balkan partners and a small number of member states. Austria, Croatia, France, Germany, Italy, Slovenia, the UK, and as of the last few years, Poland and Bulgaria as well have become involved. The Berlin process does not have its own financing mechanisms, so it functions with the support of the European Commission and international financing institutions. It does not have a steering mechanism or monitoring mechanism, so when it comes to implementation, you cannot force it. But then on the other hand, it's this flexibility and the fact that it is it's a minilateral form of cooperation that is a bonus and that gives added value. It is not a part of the enlargement process. It does, however, try to achieve similar goals, and therefore it contributes ultimately to potential integration and possibly enlargement. Another platform for engagement and cooperation is the Regional Cooperation Council. So whilst the Berlin process is a smaller format for cooperation, the Regional Cooperation Council is a bigger one. It was launched in 2008. It has 46 participants, amongst which most, but not all, of the member states, as well as the EU, represented by a representative of the High Representative of the Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, and a representative of the European Commission, so External Action Service and the Commission. The mandate is the Regional Cooperation Council serves regional cooperation and Euro-Atlantic integration of Southeast Europe in order to spark development in the region to the benefit of its people. So as you see, very large mandate as well, allowing for all kinds of cooperation if there is a will. The fact that there are these platforms outside of the EU framework is actually very useful. On the one hand, they allow all the Western Balkan partners to participate on equal footing, which is not the case in the enlargement framework, for example, where it depends how high or low you are on the ladder. Are you a potential candidate? Are you a candidate without accession open, negotiations open? Have chapters been opened? Have they been closed? Here, everyone can cooperate on an equal footing. Secondly, you don't have the competitive element that to some extent exists in the enlargement process, where the best performing gets the treat and advances the quicker, and therefore the best performing country does not really have an incentive to help the slowest performing ones, because then they will lose their edge. Here this is not the case. Cooperation between the Western Balkan partners themselves is encouraged and is a part of the way these platforms work. And a final benefit of having these platforms is, and of having actually all these different platforms within and outside the EU, is that when you have a blockage in one of them, that does not mean that engagement needs to stop. It can still continue through one of the other ones, so that is a plus. Challenges to engagement. Well, one of the challenges is that we have that many platforms. I've been saying how good it is, but it does have its own issues and negative sides. We have, as I said, several platforms. Most of them try to achieve similar goals and objectives. Most of them have the same participants. So inevitably, you're going to have overlapping and duplication. And this will inevitably lead to a waste of resources. Things are even further complicated by the lack of coherence and coordination between these platforms. And you might wonder, why do we have this lack of coherence and coordination, considering that some of the participants are always the same. We always have the Western Balkan countries, and we always have the Commission. So one would think it would be possible to coordinate at least a little bit. However, it's not as simple as that. As I said, the value added of some of these platforms is the fact that they're extremely flexible and do not have particular structures and mechanisms within which they need to cooperate. So once you introduce a coordination structure above that, then you remove that benefit of that particular flexible platform. So the truth there is somewhere in the middle. There should be more coherence and coordination, but again, it shouldn't go too far as to negate the usefulness of the platforms. Then another challenge to engagement, enlargement fatigue. And this one is both on the side of the EU and the Western Balkans. The Western Balkans are seeing how the process goes. If they look to Turkey and the decades of negotiations there, it does not encourage them to believe that there is an end to this process. So you have enlargement fatigue on the side of the Western Balkans as well. And as for the EU, as I mentioned, this has been there for several years too. Lack of ownership is another challenge to engagement. If the Western Balkans view the engagement as a box-ticking exercise, then this is not truly engagement at all. It is just, yeah, we'll tick the box, but we will not really bother to implement what we've agreed. So that is another challenge to engagement. And finally, external influences and propaganda. Well, it goes without saying that if someone wants to establish their influence in the Western Balkans, they will be looking to decrease the influence of anybody else there. So when you have external influences, they are definitely working towards decreasing the EU's influence, which means that engagement becomes much more difficult. Way forward. if we want to continue this process in any sort of engagement, in any sort of constructive way, I think the first thing that needs to happen is that both the Western Balkans and the member states need to recognize that, as Othon said, there are common challenges. We need to have a new definition of borders and how to work to deal with these challenges. We have terrorism, we have migration, we have climate change, we have cyber security. So it is in the interests of every single one of those countries within the EU and the Western Balkans to work together to overcome them, and not for some future enlargement or some future perk that might come. No, these are challenges that exist now. You need to face them. So from a purely selfish point of view, I would think if you're a leader and you want to stay a leader of a country, you would try to resolve the bigger problems that are there, which would be through cooperation in some cases. Second main thing, both the Western Balkans and the EU member states need to be treated and to act as equal partners. And here fault lies with both sides. EU member states treat the Western Balkans for the most part as recipients of EU policy. They need to acknowledge that the Western Balkans have their own experiences, their own expertise, and the EU can actually learn from them as well. This is the case, for example, as Asia Metodiova, that you will see next week during the radicalization seminar here on Wednesday. As she has written, the Western Balkans have had a lot of foreign terrorist fighters leaving, a lot considered as a proportion of their populations, and they are now dealing with the question of returnees, both the foreign terrorist fighters and their families. These are issues that the EU is facing as well, at least some of the member states are facing as well. And there is no clear solution what to do with these things and how to deal with the women, with the children, with the men. And this is something that the Western Balkans are currently experiencing. So they have knowledge about what is happening. Kosovo repatriated over 100 people recently, men, women, and children. So Kosovo actually has experience. Bosnia is considering doing the same. So this is a situation where if the EU and the Western Balkans sit together and learn from each other's expertise, rather than the EU saying, this is how we deal with these issues and you need to do the same, this can be beneficial for everyone. The Western Balkans as well need to start acting as equal partners. They need to stop thinking in terms of we need to do our homework in order to get a treat. They need to start thinking in terms of we need to deal with challenges that we're facing, we need to engage, and we need to cooperate not only when the EU tells us we need to cooperate in this field. We need to look at what our challenges are and ask the EU to cooperate in the areas that are important to us so that we can resolve those challenges. And finally, as I don't want to go over my time, is the solution to future engagement a multi-speed Europe? My answer would be yes, and this is what I am working on. And in fact, it's not a future solution, it already exists. If you look at the free travel area, the Schengen area, it includes 22 EU member states, so not all of them, and it includes 4 non-EU European states. So this is already a mini Europe that exists in the area of free travel. The same exists when it comes to intelligence cooperation. You have the counter-terrorism group in The Hague, which includes the intelligence services of all the 28 member states, plus Norway and Switzerland. And the UK has indicated that it is going to continue to cooperate with the EU through the counter-terrorism group. So this is another element where we do have a mini Europe, including not only EU but non-EU European states. So I believe that this is the way forward for engagement with the region and in general engagement within the EU. It seems to be what's happening within and outside of the EU. The variable geometry within the EU has been spoken about a lot. Who has opt-outs, who doesn't, what do they have opt-outs from? I often have to just use charts to see, okay, what applies to whom here. So I believe that would be the future. So I will stop here so as not to go too much over my time, and I look forward to your questions afterwards. Thank you
very much, Mirena. And thank giving us a mapping of the issues and clearly kind of designing what the context is, but also being normative as well, what the future should be. And I have to say here that it's the first time I've chaired many, many panels. First time I chair somebody who's self-timed, actually. That's actually, something new.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid my presentation will have more question marks than answers, as was in the case of the previous one, because both topics that I'll be covering, which is NATO and the US, there's obviously more question marks that we may ask rather than give answers. I do apologize in advance if I'll sound slightly sarcastic during my presentation, so that's just a warning in advance. So just to give a very quick outlook, I'll talk a bit about sort of the overall a bit of historical approach of NATO in Southeast Europe, because one has to understand the way NATO got involved in the region to understand the current position. A few words about the current policy or lack thereof of the United States in Southeast Europe, and what I was trying to be sort of very positive, a wish list, rather than put policy recommendations or something that should happen, sort of things that hopefully should be addressed, but question remains open to what extent it's actually realistic. So just to say a few words about NATO in Southeast Europe. NATO was very hesitant to get involved in the region. It didn't anticipate that it will stay that long in the region physically, and now one of the objectives was to actually leave physically as fast as possible. I know that I'm simplifying the situation a bit, especially in the context where we have Montenegro, Albania, and obviously Croatia as members of the European Union, but talking more about the sort of direct presence of military forces in the region. So, very quick overview from the very beginning. In the 1990s, obviously early 1990s was a point when NATO was trying to redefine and find a new purpose after the end of Cold War. So in terms of the Balkans involvement, the summit in London, 1990, calling for substantial changes in the organization to ensure it could adapt to rapidly evolving political landscape. And then the one, 1991, calling for reconfiguring of NATO's military and to focus on small and highly mobile forces geared for fast reaction. Looking at the beginning of 1990s and the conflict in Yugoslavia, we had certain members hesitating to intervene. Now, the issue was that these were the biggest ones. UK, France, US administrations, both Republican and Democratic. Other countries supporting intervention, such as Denmark, and the Secretary General at the time, Manfred Wörner. Situation was obviously evolving as the situation in Yugoslavia was evolving. So during the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, we had a more proactive involvement, the night flight operation, the deliberate force operation. UK was still opposing something more significant, a more significant intervention or more significant involvement. US was getting more and more engaged. Kosovo, very often labeled by many analysts, especially in the region, especially Serbian speakers, or the Serbian media, branded as NATO's war. So obviously, especially the Operation Allied Force, where for 78 days NATO planes were bombarding what was then Yugoslavia. We could see the changing approach of NATO to the region, with then Secretary General saying that the objective was to prevent more human suffering, more repression, violence against civilian population in Kosovo, and the change of an approach of the British government with Tony Blair's, first of all, his speech in Chicago, but then his quote, I said, essentially as a moral issue, that this has to happen. Obviously, to a large extent, it was also a response to Srebrenica and the events taking place in Bosnia and Herzegovina. There was this assumption that these things should not happen again, hence the need for a stronger NATO intervention. So one can see that NATO's approach was changing, was evolving as the situation on the ground was changing in Southeast Europe, but also as the governments, member states of NATO, were changing their approach, but also the personalities within the governments that were changing. I mean, some things stay the same. If we look at Emmanuel Macron's recent speech about NATO, I mean, French approach to NATO has always been very hesitant towards any more direct involvement. Now, after the conflict, we've seen a gradual withdrawal of NATO from the region, apart from the fact that obviously we've had NATO enlargements of Slovenia, Albania, Croatia, Montenegro, hopefully North Macedonia this year, Partnership for Peace, where Serbia, Bosnia-Herzegovina joined in 2006 as well. What we've seen in the region, especially in terms of the KFOR mission, that's present in Kosovo since 1999, that majority of soldiers who are stationing in Kosovo are actually European. There is a significant American contingent, but looking at total numbers, majority of soldiers stationing there are actually European. So very often speakers like to underline the fact that around 80-90% of the staff, both military and non-military people, there are coming from European countries. In terms of after the conflict approach of NATO to the region, one might see more of an ad hoc involvement related to very specific issues or events taking place in the region. Now, one of the issues raised after the events, especially in Montenegro, the failed coup, where the nationalistic forces were trying to overthrow the Montenegrin government, was the idea of creating counter-hybrid support teams, which consist of experts coming from different NATO countries. The idea of these teams is to go into certain countries and address issues related to hybrid threats. So these counter-hybrid support teams, the deployment to countries from Southeast Europe was agreed on a NATO summit, and for the first time they were deployed to Montenegro in November last year. So what they actually do, what sort of who's members, I mean, who are the people who are actually involved in these hybrid support teams, is still under development. It's still ongoing. I mean, we'll see. We still have to see the sort of the results, or where does it go, or where will it go? So just to overall quickly underline the NATO's involvement in Southeast Europe. On the one hand, one can see that NATO, as I said at the beginning, was hesitant to get involved. Now the idea would be for NATO forces to completely withdraw, especially from Kosovo. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, taking into consideration the context of Brexit, the UK government, while withdrawing from the European Union, it very often, or it seems to be looking at NATO as a platform through which it might be involved in Southeast Europe. So there's a lot of thought, and I believe funding as well, put into sort of the more approach to the region via NATO, especially around issue of disinformation and countering hybrid threats inside of the region. So this is a new development. It's something that's still ongoing, something that's very flexible. We'll see how it goes after the UK actually leaves the EU, and how this switch of focus from sort of approach via the EU to approach via NATO is going to take place. But this is one sort of interesting issue to look at on the ground. Now, looking at the United States and Southeast Europe, I'm afraid in this case there'll be more question marks that one might ask than answers that can be given. The very general first question would be who is actually running US foreign policy, because when we look at the US political scene, one can identify different actors, which also has its relation to the region of Southeast Europe. So we have obviously the White House, we have State Department, we have Department of Defense, especially at the time when James Mattis was the Secretary of State for Defense. Many people were saying that this was the alternative sort of foreign policy center, focusing on Central Europe but also on Southeast Europe, that these were run mainly from Pentagon. Then we have the National Security Council, and interestingly enough, we have US Congress that's interested very much in the situation in Southeast Europe. Just to mention, in December, the 3rd of December, I believe, there was a hearing, around 30 experts on the region, talking on various topics, to US congressmen, trying to get their knowledge and trying to sort of learn more, but also promote issues related to Southeast Europe in Washington. The second question would be who is actually running US policy towards Southeast Europe. We have, interestingly enough, two special envoys for the region. One of them is a highly respected diplomat, Matthew Palmer. He is US Special Representative to the Western Balkans. He's State Department's Special Representative. The other person is US Special Envoy for Belgrade-Pristina Dialogue, Richard Grenell, who's also the US ambassador to Germany. Some people are saying it's good that there is an increased interest of the US administration in the region. Others are pointing out that it might be difficult to coordinate one voice inside of the region when you have two separate people with two seemingly distinct sort of areas of focus, but overlapping to a large extent. When I asked recently a colleague from the region what are the actual achievements of these people in the region, they pointed out the probable launch of flights between Belgrade and Pristina, where apparently US administration was heavily involved. This was mooted a couple of days ago that there might be a, I believe, Germanwings flight in between both capital cities. We'll see what comes out of that, but if that's the example of a successful involvement of US policy in the region, then I mean, this is where my sarcastic aspect of my presentation comes out. Apologies for that. And the third issue about US involvement in the region, throughout the recent years at least, or at least the last 2 decades, if not more, we could see a alignment between the US and the EU approach to the region. It seems that we still have a broken line between Brussels and Washington, and especially the case of talks between Serbia and Kosovo about border adjustments or border changes, however one would label that, showed divisions in between both, where US was seemingly pushing for a solution of adjusting borders between Kosovo and Serbia, whereas European Union, especially Germany, was strongly opposing that. But then again, there were many voices in the US saying that the US position wasn't as set as it seemed to be, because there are many voices also opposing changing borders inside of the region. Hence, the situation is very unclear here. Now, going into the last slide, the question of wish list. The very first thing, going back to the issue of a broken line between Washington and Brussels, it seems that we will have a EU special representative for the Western Balkans. The Minister of Foreign Affairs of Slovakia, Miroslav Lajčák, is mooted to be the next representative of the EU special envoy for the region. I believe it still hasn't been confirmed. It's sort of a public, open gossip circulating around Brussels and also the media. So question is, how will the special rep, EU special rep and the US special reps, I mean both of them, cooperate inside of the region? We have an additional dynamic there of Josep Borrell, the high rep, the new high rep of the European Union for the region, and the additional dynamic, they mentioned the fact that he's Spanish, Miroslav Lajčák is Slovakian. Both countries do not recognize Kosovo. So to what extent EU will be considered by the Albanian side as an objective, independent actor in the dialogue, where two main people involved in there represent or come from countries that do not recognize Kosovo. So it's an additional huge question mark. As I said at the beginning, I'll have many question marks in the presentation. So we'll see how that goes. The next point is something that NATO is actually already doing. So its involvement moving towards support in countering hybrid threats. Now I understand that in literature, and many experts are saying hybrid is this very fashionable word, a buzzword that's circulating since the Ukraine crisis started, where we put actually everything that we've seen already before, but we try to categorize it into one single word. But it actually helps in terms of policy. It actually helps in terms of analysis and sort of more analytical approach. The deployment of the special task force to Montenegro last year shows that this is the direction where NATO would like to go. The common approach in Serbia-Kosovo dialogue, I've already mentioned it. The US doesn't seem to have one sort of single approach. European Union is also divided. The dialogue doesn't seem to be going in any direction. So if we are talking about the wish list, that would be the wish list for the next decade. That actually the whole dialogue moves forward. And the very last point, public engagement, which relates more to NATO, and this is something that NATO is doing. If you look even on the second page of the program, the NATO Public Diplomacy Division is sponsoring these events. So this is part of the things that NATO is doing, and I think is very aware of the fact that they have to do it more due to the issues I was raising earlier, and NATO's involvement in the region not being very popular among all of the people living in Southeast Europe. So this is a huge challenge. They know that they should be doing it, they are doing it, but as part of the wish list is that they should do more of that. I think, as I said, I've raised many questions. I'm more than happy to try to answer to the questions you might have, or maybe you have answers to the questions I actually raised during my presentation, so I'll be also very curious to hear them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jarek.